What Dr. Srinivasan asked me to talk to you today about was about stem cell transplantation. And I thought I'd do this in three parts. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how we established the treatment of stem cell transplantation at Christian Medical College, Vellore. And then I'll tell you a little bit about what is happening with regard to use and misuse of stem cells in the community today, the hype and hoopla around what it can do and it cannot do, and finish with a very short note on cord blood banking and its relevance to what Dr. Srinivasan spoke in the beginning. So, if you look at, it is I guess human folly to want to live longer, And with all our efforts at nutrition, hygiene and health, people in the Stone Age, the A. Blue graph, lived in their 40s and most died by then. Now, of course, in the more developed countries, people are reaching close to 80 or 90 years of survival. And what has brought this about certainly is not just healthcare, but nutrition and hygiene being probably the more important contributors. But by no means has healthcare been not an important contributor to this. It is very important. And in healthcare, what we have are those treatment protocols, those treatment options, which were small molecules and peptides, which allowed diseased organs to function better. But you can only make a diseased organ function better to a point beyond which you can't make it normal. And therefore, the concept of transplantation came up. Change the part. So for a mechanical engineer, it's very easy. A part's not functioning, order it from the store, change it, 2 hours later your car is on the road, as good as new. The human body, unfortunately, was not like that in the whole concept of transplantation. So, in the field of transplantation, one of the most successful stories has been that of blood cell or the hematopoietic stem cell transplantation. This really got a boost in terms of its need and importance after this happened at the end of the Second World War. And people realized that with radiation injury, what would happen is that a large number of people in the community would be affected, and the main reason for their death, apart from those who die of radiation burns, is the fact that the hematopoietic system would be lost. And so how do you regenerate the hematopoietic system? Apart from that, there were these kind of diseases, and I realize that we have a very mixed audience today. All I'm trying to show you are some cells in the blood which depict blood cancers. So there were a few people getting cured of blood cancers, but there were many who were not getting cured by chemotherapy alone, and they needed something more done. And so the story began of stem cell transplantation in the 1950s. In the 1950s, at Seattle. Actually, the work began in New York first, but they moved to Seattle. And the pioneers were Donald Thomas and Rainer Storr. And what I want you to just notice is that it took almost 20-25 years of hard work, starting with animal models. They actually reported the first successful transplant in 1957, but it took much longer before it actually became available to the vast majority of people in the world. And it was only in the mid to late 70s, and in fact in the early 80s, that when you say allogeneic, you mean taking stem cells from another person and transplanting it to another human being. When you say autologous, it's taking your own stem cells and transplanting it to yourself. So it took quite a bit of work over 2 or 3 decades before it became common. Now, of course, this is data from what is called the CIBMTR, it's an international registry. The actual number being done in the world is probably double this. So about 30 to 40,000 transplants are probably done annually. And so this really made a huge difference to the world. And in recognition of that fact, this is E. Donald Thomas, who was given Nobel in 1990. This, by the way, is Joseph Murray, who was given Nobel the same year for his work on renal transplantation. So what exactly do we mean by transplantation? You know, all of us have blood, and that blood is generated in the bone marrow, and if that bone marrow becomes diseased, then transplantation talks about destroying the existing bone marrow and replacing it with something that would be compatible with that person's body. So for all kinds of diseases, it may be malignancy, it may be failure of the bone marrow, or it may be genetic disorders like thalassemia and many more. These are diseases, some of which have no other treatment other than changing the bone marrow. So when you have a person like that, then give that person strong chemotherapy or radiation to destroy the existing bone marrow. You then take stem cells, which may come from the bone marrow or from other sources. It used to be all related donors, but nowadays we are talking about unrelated donors, and that is where cord blood banking would come in as an option. So you take the stem cells after you condition this person, you take the stem cells which are matched with this patient, you infuse it like a blood transfusion, and then if all goes well, then the patient is cured. That's bone marrow transplantation. Sounds simple. But you know, the main issue is that unlike other organ transplantation, where you are protecting the organ that you have transplanted from the immune system of the recipient, here the recipient has lost his immune system, and the recipient is actually a bag of cells completely at the mercy of the graft that's coming in, because the graft is the organ with the army. The recipient lost its army. So this becomes very complicated, and that is why we've had so few centers in the country, unfortunately, doing this treatment even after so many years. Now the problems here are, one, that this donor, a suitable donor, is available for only a third of the patients who can benefit from stem cell transplantation. And even though we would cure 50 to 90%, depending on how you select your cases, of patients who actually undergo transplantation, in reality, you know, if you started with 100 patients, only 30 of them, 35 of them will have a donor. So 70 are out because they didn't have a donor. And of this 30, 35, you cure between 50 and 90 depending on what disease they had. So ultimately, you are helping a small number for various reasons, one of which is lack of a suitable donor. So what exactly do we do? We take bone marrow from the pelvic bone, okay, usually from the back. And this is what's being done in an operation theatre. But after that, so actually the poor donor goes to the theatre. The patient actually sits happily in the ward and just gets a blood transfusion. So there is no magical surgeon here who stands for 10 hours and does a, we are not as clever and smart as the smart surgeons. So we just transfuse this blood, and thankfully the stem cells find their way to the right place in the bone marrow. Now this is how it used to be, but about 15 years ago we realized, or maybe even a little more, that you can actually make these stem cells come out of the bone marrow by giving a growth factor, so that this child whose brother has leukemia and requires a transplant has been given a growth factor that pushes the stem cells out of the blood. So, we have started taking less and less bone marrow for stem cells, and now more often we use peripheral blood so that the donor does not have to undergo anesthesia and go to the theatre. So the donor lies down like this for 2 or 3 hours. This is an apheresis unit. The blood comes out, spins, takes out the stem cells in a little bag, usually about 150 to 200 ml of blood with the stem cells in it, and that's what gets infused to the patient. This just shows you the evolution of stem cell transplant unit at CMC Vellore. So this is 1986 when we started. In 3 years, we were not the first. We were by no means the first. In 1983, Tata Memorial Hospital started in Mumbai. We started in 1986. We had a single bed unit. Rapidly this was not enough. So in 1990, we converted this to a 3-bed unit. These were the 3 units. In 2008, we actually now have an 18-bed unit. So we have 10 beds for allogeneic transplant and we have 8 beds for autologous. And actually, so we have a fairly large unit now. Now, that, everything you see in this picture, for those of you who have not had the misfortune to visit Vellore, this is CMC Vellore, okay? It's evolved over more than 100 years. It started in 1900, and the streets around, so this is this street, and there's a street on this side, which is this one, and they're pretty dirty and dusty. It's small town India. It's not Novembakkam or so it's very dusty. And but we now have a fairly nice transplant unit, 10 beds. We have protocols for entry and exit. That's our room. We take fairly conventional precautions for food and water. So everything before it goes in is subjected to a very conventional sterilization procedure. In a pressure cooker, the water that they wash their mouth with or have a bath is also sterilized with a UV system, which is monitored microbiologically. So, these are important aspects apart from the medical treatment that they get. So the story began in 1986 at our center, and in the first 4 or 5 years we did the review. From 92-93 we had a reasonable program of about 10-20, and now we do about 110 to 120 allogeneic and about 30-40 autologous transplants a year. We were doing matched related, so from the family donors, and that still goes on. That's the mainstay of the program, and that's the average cost for that. For the last 2-3 years, we started doing matched unrelated donor transplants because, as I told you, there was a need to address those patients who did not have family donors, and also what we call the haploidentical, and I'll come back to that. Now, what do we do these transplants for? We do them for genetic disorders like thalassemia, and that has been a major focus with us from the beginning, about a third of our transplants. The rest are essentially blood cancers and bone marrow failure. What we mean by bone marrow failure, plastic anemia or myelodysplastic syndrome, where blood production drops and people become susceptible to infections or bleeding because of that. So that really is the mainstay of the allogeneic transplant program. The autologous program is essentially to address malignancies such as multiple myeloma or lymphoma or acute myeloid leukemia. So that really forms the bulk of the autologous stem cell transplant program at our center. Now I want to tell you just a little bit about the thalassemia program as an example of how we actually need to learn constantly. Even though the thalassemia transplant program started in the world in the 1980s, Dr. Srinivasan mentioned that there is a huge public health problem with thalassemia, particularly in the western, northern and eastern parts of the country. The southern part is spared, but for their transplant, patients now of course come mostly to Vellore. So we have 10 to 15,000 children being born with thalassemia major every year. Completely preventable situation. Unfortunately, the government of India, no state government except Gujarat, really has a major prevention program. So a few get treated with transplant. And from 1991 to 2009, we transplanted about 288, which is analyzed now. It's over 300. And you'll find that actually most of these children have been poorly managed, so that they are in poor condition by the time they come to transplant. If we could transplant these children early, before they get damage to their organs, their results would be much better. So, class 1 are the good risk category, but we have only 5% of that. Most of them are in the class 2 or intermediate, or the poor risk category, about half and half. So, what are the results, right? Now, if you look at the class 1, about 85% of them are doing fine. This is at around 10 years. We're talking about, because we started in 91, we have very long follow-up on these people. So this is around 10-12 years. Those who are class 1 and 2, so they are in the 80-85% range. Not perfect, but stem cell transplant for no disease ever anywhere in the world is perfect. So if you are in the 85-90% range, that's about where you will get. But we are seriously worried about this group where it's only 61%. And in fact, we think that this classification that was given by the Italians who started this transplant does not really apply very well to our patients, because we classified these patients into those who were super high risk as opposed to standard high risk. And then we found that those who were super high risk in the class 3 actually had only about 20% survival. So this group was doing really badly with the kind of transplant protocol we were using. We really had to do something about this. While this group, within the so-called poor risk group, was not so bad at about 70%, still lower than the 80-85 that the class 1 and 2 had. So what could we do for them? We now changed, for the last 2 years, we have changed our protocol from busulfan to triosulfan. The conditioning has been changed. Busulfan was damaging the liver too much, causing too much toxicity, and now for about 20 patients who have been treated by this protocol, we have a 90% survival of this group, the high risk class 3. So that 20% has changed. So it shows you how even 20, 30 years after transplantation started for thalassemia in the world, 20 years after we started, we're still learning, we're still trying to do better for those who were not doing so well with the previous protocol. Of course, this has a price. Unfortunately, busulfan is cheap. Tablets were cheap, injection was very expensive in the world. A company in India started making busulfan injection. It used to cost almost $10,000 to $15,000 if we had to buy injection busulfan from outside. Now, for less than $1,000, 40,000 to 50,000 rupees, we can get injection busulfan made in India, which is very good. Unfortunately, triosulfan is still not made in India. There is only one manufacturer in the world, and one course of triosulfan, depending on the size of the patient, is 3 to 4 lakhs. So when our total cost of transplant was 8 to 10, imagine paying 3 to 4 for one drug. So there is a catch here. It's not something that we can offer everybody, but at least those who can pay will, even if they are poor risk, older. So now we are able to take up much older patients, people who are in their late teens or in the early 20s also, which earlier we would be very scared because their chance of survival was very poor with treatment. Now, we have tried to spread this message around the country, and this just shows you the people who have trained with us over the last 15-20 years and work in different parts of the country, from Srinagar to Jeevan. Okay, so it's from Kolkata to places in Gujarat. So that's something, and in fact, the stem cell transplant centers in the till about the early 90s, there were only 3 centers. And then we added a few between 91 and 95. Between 95 and 2000, there were about 9 centers. But we started our training program in 98. And most of these students who have gone out have now started their own transplant programs. Small ones, they're doing a few at the moment, but hopefully they will grow and provide this service around the country. So this is the distribution of the 30-odd transplant centers in the country. Still very inadequate. If you compare us with other Asian countries, we're actually much lower. If you compare us with Europe or North America, we are nowhere. So there's a huge need for more transplant centers to come up. This shows you the story of transplantation in India. Started in 1983 in Tata Memorial Hospital, but as you can see, all of us were doing very little in the first 8-10 years. Okay, between TMH, us, and the All India Institute, we were doing very few. It's only from the early 90s that the numbers have really picked up, and we have now done about 4,000 plus transplants in the country. Okay? And these are the allogeneic transplants, these are the autologous transplants, year-wise. These are, so in a year, for a population of 1.2 billion, if we do only 600 transplants, it's nothing. It's really nothing. So, we really need more people in this field, in hematology, in transplantation. It's demanding, but it's rewarding too. Okay. This is the story of different centers. So this is CMC Vellore, we are somewhere around 1,200. This is TMH. Unfortunately, their program has really faltered over the last 10, 15 years, and they've just not had the people. You need a team. You can't do it alone for too long. And you need a team, and I think that is where, but now this is one of our students in Pune. He's doing very well. He's got a team. This is Apollo Chennai. They're doing well. And then there are several others. The Army Hospital in Delhi also. So, this is Apollo Chennai, is it right here? So, but these are the new ones. All little programs, but hopefully they will grow and add some more. Now, so we have, we're doing something in the country, but it's by no means enough, because, that's the number of patients per year some of whom, not all of whom, thankfully, some of whom will require this treatment. There's also an issue of resources. While there are many people who can't afford the economic boom and the support from employers that people have in the country now. So even if there are 300-400 million people who their own money or support from employers can afford this transplant, the resources that we have in terms of the number of centers that can offer this service is really inadequate. So that's a real need to create more transplant centers with infrastructure and personnel. And then, of course, many of these will not have related donors. So how do you find when, if you don't have money, well, you feel bad, and if you have money and you don't have a donor, and you knew that you could actually get a donor if you were somewhere else, that's a different kind of feeling bad. Both are bad. So what can we do about these donor business? So here we have three options. If you didn't have a family-related donor who was matched with you, then thankfully people realize that unlike donating a kidney or liver where you lose the organ, in donating blood stem cells you actually lose nothing. It's a more sophisticated or slightly more complicated way of donating blood, essentially. People used to take bone marrow, now actually you can take stem cells from the blood. So anyone sitting in this room, as long as you are between 18 and 65 or so, you would be eligible to donate if you are willing to take GCSF, which is like insulin, for 5 days, and you will have stem cells circulating in the blood. You go lie down in Dr. Srinivasan's blood bank, and he will connect you to one of those machines, and over 2-3 hours they will collect enough stem cells, and then it can go to anywhere in the world. That's how we've started doing the matched unrelated donor transplants. So there are about 18 million people in several international registries who are now willing to donate for anybody in the world. And we are finding that actually, we used to think that because we are Indians, we are not Caucasian, we will not find too many donors. But actually we are finding 60-70% of our patients whom we have searched so far are finding donors from international registries. So cost is an issue, of course, and I'll come back to that. There's another way of doing transplant. Classically we were taught that you do transplants from a fully matched donor. But there are modifications of this technique where you can actually take a half-matched donor. And everybody in the world has a half-matched donor in their parents, if not their siblings. Okay? So you can actually do transplants which are called haploidentical. Unfortunately, these require special processing of stem cells that again makes it very expensive, and the immunological recovery is slow. In our country, the results of haplotransplants so far, even at our center, have not been so good. So we are very cautious proceeding with this. Cord blood has been a major source. So starting from the early 90s, when cord blood banking started, actually, people are doing cord blood transplants, and I'll come back to this at the end of the talk. So this was our first matched unrelated donor transplant, a young man with myeloid leukemia, type of blood cancer, who had failed chemotherapy, and he got a transplant from the NMDP, the National Marrow Donor Program in the US. He spent about $65,000. He could afford it. He got his transplant. He was cured. That was our first mud transplant in 2008. And if we get a graft from the US registry, it costs about $40,000. If we get a graft from the European registries, it costs us about 12,000 to 50,000 euros. So that's the kind of cost we are looking at for the graft alone. Then after that, it's the usual 8-10 for the related donors, maybe a little bit more because complications are a little more with the unrelated donor transplants. This is our first successful haplotransplant. This was again a child with the blood cancer who had failed chemotherapy, and in this case the father was the donor. He is now more than 2 years going to school. He's fine. Now this person is actually a medical representative. He didn't have much money at all, but he was able to garner from the community, and he could collect all this money. We gave him whatever subsidies we could, and 80% of this cost was actually subsidized. But that was the total cost that was required for. But he's cured. He's well. So the cost of transplant actually in the world is pretty high. This is India with about, I told you, about 8 to 10 lakhs. When it goes well for related donors, it can be much more, running into more than 1 crore if you do it overseas. So that essentially was the story about stem cell transplant, blood stem cell transplant, as it evolved over the last 40-50 years and where it is now. Now imagine a situation where these stem cells have been known for 40-50 years. Cord blood has been known, bone marrow has been known, and people were not trying to push these cells into every possible disease till the last 5-10 years. So what happened? Everybody knew how to aspirate bone marrow, but nobody was taking it and pushing it into people with stroke or myocardial infarction or a degenerative brain disease. So, these are some of those diseases where, whereas hematologists, we were fortunate to have a stem cell which will cure the diseases that we were interested in. But what about the cardiologist with the failing heart after myocardial infarction, or the neurologist and the patients who have had stroke and cannot recover? They were desperate too. So naturally they were interested in using cells that could actually regenerate those organs. That was an aspiration, that was an hope, right? And what happened about 10-12 years ago is that people realized that stem cells were not limited to the bone marrow. Actually, most organs in the body have stem cells. We only need to learn to identify them, isolate them, expand them, and then maybe use it for what has now become the buzzword, regenerative medicine. So, you can regenerate damaged organs, right? So, with that hope, there is much hype around what stem cells can do. Theoretically speaking, in some animal models, people have shown that damaged organs can be repaired and they can function better. So, the challenge really is to find these cells and then get them in adequate numbers in a quality that may regenerate organs. That is where the field is, that is where research is. Nothing other than hematopoietic stem cell transplant for blood diseases is standard of care. Everything else is research. So, this field actually can apply to many areas. It can apply to study of biology. How does development occur? It can apply to the field of pharmacology and therapeutics. Instead of doing animal models, you can test these in these stem cells. And it can of course apply to all those diseases where there was no other curative treatment available, so you could use them for this. And this has led to 3 major areas of stem cell use. One is just biologists, pure science. One is in drug development in the pharmaceutical industry. Instead of doing animal studies, you can actually use human cells to do this. But most importantly, in the normal hospital setting, you have this field of regenerative medicine. Now, while there's a lot of hope here, we should not jump the gun, because there are certain principles of how transplants, how treatments evolve. And if you recall the slide that I showed you earlier, even though they were able to do successful animal transplants in the 1950s, it took almost 20-25 years of research and systematic work before it became widely available. So here, just because we find some cells which have stem cell-like properties, we can't just start saying, okay, we will treat all people with myocardial infarction with stem cells now and charge money for it. We will treat people with paraplegia or stroke and say we will charge money for it. And that is where the problem comes. So what has happened is that instead of taking this field in a systematic way from bench work to animal models to bigger animals, and in some cases non-human primates, and this also will then require, so far doctors have had it easy, because they sit in a hospital, somebody produces the drug, it comes on a shelf in a nice box, all clean, all ready to be injected or used. Okay? So So now hospitals have to, physicians have to not only do this research, but actually learn how to produce this locally. So many hospitals, many big hospitals around the world are actually creating their own little GMP centers where they can process cells for human use. So this is a complicated field. It's not something where you'll get products from some central manufacturer. You really have to understand what you're trying to do. Now, how did this hype come around? So this is 2001, and Jamie Thompson is one of those who actually identified embryonic stem cells. And scientists need money for research. And they'll get money if there is strong public support. So they need to hype up. That's a game all of us play in different ways. You need to hype up what you're saying, but you do it not to fool the public, but you do it to impress your funders, because you want them to fund your research. That's the game, unfortunately. But then what happens is that they figure on all these magazines, and the public thinks cure is around the corner. And even that's not bad as long as it remains confined to the public, but it becomes a big issue when mischievous scientists and physicians start then promising cure when cure does not exist, and then start using these stem cells for treating diseases on half information, on almost false promises, and then charging money for that. And that is where the problem is. And so we are not far from that. This is India Today, sometime last year. Okay, how stem cells can save you, right? Actually, it's not going to save you right now, because nobody has figured out how it's going to save you. And if you read this, there are guidelines, but look at this. Somebody who organized the Stem Cell Global Foundation, the world market for stem cell therapy is projected to increase, estimated $30 billion, 2009 to 96 billion. I don't know how they make these calculations, when not a single therapy beyond the hematopoietic stem cell transplant for blood diseases has been standardized so far after 5-10 years of research. In fact, there are many venture capitalists who have stopped funding this. Jeevan Corporation, that was doing the first embryonic stem cell clinical trial after 2-3 years of fighting with the FDA, pulled out of this field completely 2 weeks ago. After spending many millions of dollars, they realized that this is a murky area, they're not sure of returns on investment at all. They pulled out completely. So Jeevan Corporation does not involve itself in stem cells anymore as of a week or 10 days ago. So this is a minefield. You have to have a long-term view if you want to invest in this for profit, because you don't know whether profit will ever come. It may come. These are the kind of data on which this has been based. You have people, individuals, some of them very educated. This is an IAS officer who claim benefit. This is good. It's a patient testimony, but unfortunately, this is not science. This is not evidence strong enough to justify changing this from experimental procedures to standard of care. And the next thing that's happening in this area is, where can you get stem cells from? Cord blood, of course. Okay, so cord blood banking has its good parts, but cord blood banking can also be misused, or you're given false hopes and promises as to what cord blood can do, and that is where we come to, this is week, January 2000, the Great Indian Fraud, and they're talking about essentially people being told that so many diseases can be cured if you save your child's cord blood. Okay, so treatment of 75 diseases being researched, they say, but in the next line they will say as many as can be treated with cord blood, something that was thrown away as medical waste. So, of course, nothing is lost here because it's medical waste except the money that you're paying. As long as you don't mind parting with about ₹1,00,000 and understand that you're doing it with no scientific basis at all at the moment, it's fine, it's your choice. There's a service provider, there's a customer, and as long as the two understand what they're doing, who are we to say don't do it? But the scientific evidence is against it, and it's not always so safe. So this is a story of a child from Israel. He was about 4 or 5 years old with this neurodegenerative disease called ataxia telangiectasia. And he went to Russia in 2005 and had fetal brain stem cells injected into his brain. And he came back. And of course he didn't improve. And he was just like that till 4 or 5 years later, when he suddenly developed tumors in his brain and spinal cord. And these tumors were not his tissue. The DNA, the genetic material in that tumor was not his. Where did it come from? It's a good guess, but not, you don't have to guess too hard. So, why is this happening? This is happening because, as I showed you earlier, there are people with diseases which do not have good treatment. So they are desperate. We also have, for once, a novel therapeutic product. You see, when we read about new discoveries, it's always through major pharmaceuticals. It's always under IPR. It's always got a complicated or secret formula or processing that's not available to everyone. But here is now a possibility of a treatment, a stem cell, which is available to anybody. You can process bone marrow or cord blood in your garage, almost. You know, the technology is so simple. So now you have a therapeutic material that you can use as you wish. And at least in some countries, including ours, we unfortunately do not have clear regulatory processes to control who gets what kind of treatment. And of course that's matched with all the hype that scientists themselves have created, and that's a perfect recipe for misuse. And unfortunately that's what's happening. So to finish, let me just tell you a little bit about cord blood. Okay, so the first successful cord blood transplant was done for a genetic disease, which is a marrow failure, in 1988. In 1991, Pablo Rubinstein started the first cord blood bank in New York. Now there are more than 100 cord blood banks in the world, with more than 500,000 cord blood units stored in them. And more than 25,000 cord blood transplants have been done around the world. So it certainly is a well-recognized source of an alternate donor for hematopoietic stem cells for hematological disease. It is not by any means a proven therapy for just about anything in the world. Okay, that should be very clear. So cord blood banking now has become two types, and this second lot has come only in the last 5-10 years. In the first 10-15 years almost, there was no concept of a private cord blood banking, because nobody said stem cells will cure everything in the world. These scientists who found these stem cells and then tried to hype it up a bit to get funding for their research, unfortunately had a side effect of creating this impression in the community that these stem cells will cure, heart failure, stroke, you name it, it will cure. So now we have this concept of private. So what is really the stand on that of the scientific bodies? So the American Society of Bone Marrow Transplant had a very clear guideline, and what it says is that expectant parents are encouraged to donate their newborn umbilical cord blood for public banking when that option is available. Private storage of cord blood for future use by the newborn is not routinely recommended, okay? Because there is no scientific basis. What does the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology say? They say the same thing, but they also add another dimension to this. Because why is this happening with such speed? It's a for-profit, it's a business. And again, of course, anybody is entitled to do a business as long as you are honest about it. So if you give all the correct information and not lure people by that ad I showed you, invincible armor. That was the ad, invincible armor. It's by no means invincible armor at all. So, give the right information, and after that, if people want to bank it, sure. The European Group on Ethics again says the EGE is in favor of public donation because in all the countries of cord blood transplantation, allogenics obtained from donation. Opposed to private storage because it's purely hypothetical. The fact that it can be used is hypothetical. Now, there may be an exception to this. And what's that exception where you may want to do private cord blood banking? That exception will be that if you have a family where there is a child who has a disease that can benefit from a stem cell transplant, then you might want to bank that cord blood. So in that situation, it may be justified. What are the costs? In 2004, in the US, I believe, it was about 1,500 units for storage and about $1,500 for storage. $50 per annum was the maintenance cost. 2011 it has gone up a little bit. Now, what really is the utilization? So in 2 banks, out of 355,000 cord blood units saved, 77 were used for allo, 32 for auto. So this is an expensive business because it costs a lot of money to preserve so much cord blood. And that is the reason why in countries like India, no public cord blood banking has evolved. Because it requires investment and there's no clarity on how much will be used when. What inventory size do we need before a sizable number of people will actually benefit from that? And that data depends on what the HLA heterogeneity in our population is. So it is, maintaining cord bloods can be, and doing mud transplants from cord blood is an expensive process, but we can't expect the world to save us. 1.2 billion people cannot rely on the rest of the world to say, you do it for us and we will borrow as and when we need. So certainly there is a need, there is a place for cord blood banking in this country, for having donor registries. And in that sense, I'm very pleased and proud in a way that this is happening in Chennai, because I'm not aware of any other public cord blood banking effort in the country. There are many who are doing private cord blood banking in the for-profit sector, but I'm not aware of any other public cord blood banking, which certainly will be a help to those who are seeking transplant in this country. Also wanted to mention that the only other volunteer donor registry that has really managed to put its act together and offer, we have used 3 of their donors for transplant. Both these agencies are in this city, so we need to be proud of that. Having said that, I must say that actually, I know that there are many very influential people sitting in this audience, so I want to say something that's been bothering me. That's the fact that life science institutions and life science research institutions have not evolved in Chennai at all in the last 20, 30, 40 years. And I'm comparing this with our sister city, Bangalore. We have a 6-lane highway coming up connecting the two. But you look at Bangalore, they had Indian Institute of Science for 100 years or more. And the last 15, 20 years, 4 or 5 major life science institutions have come up there. And life science and biotech goes a long way, not only towards developing industry and employment and revenue, but also towards, making an intellectual society. So, if any of you have the ears of the powers that be, then please, talk to them as to why they are not concentrating on creating more life science institutions in this city as it expands. I'll stop with that. I really want to thank you for your attention. But before I finish, I wanted to tell you that all that we do requires a huge team. And this is what we were about 2 years ago. It's a little bit more now. I also want to mention Dr. Maman Chandy, who is my teacher, my mentor, and he is retired now, but he's really the one who took the steps to set up our department in the institution starting in the mid-80s. Thank you so much once again.